Good morning, you wonderful mutants. Joel Clark here, lead designer of Lone Wolf Fist, and I really should start saying, like, almost sole designer or something like that. Although, I really. It's been long enough now that I forget how much credit I owe to people that actually put the foundational bedrock of the game in place, which were universally not me. So I should probably not get a big head about it. Anyway, speaking about foundational bedrock, I have almost completed what I once referred to as the last great design hurdle of Lone Wolf Fist, which is the domain rules, which are also the montage scene rules, which are also the campaign arc rules, which are also the crafting rules, as it turns out, which are also kind of the training rules, which are also the old school montage action rules, which I thought I discarded, but apparently this was their home all along. And they're also the warfare rules, and they're also the resource rules, and they're also the economy rules. Basically, if there was a thing I wanted in the game, and I wasn't quite sure how to make it manifest, eventually it all kind of got kicked into this section. So when I say last great design hurdle, what I mean is all of the loose ends must be tied up in this chapter, um, almost universally. And I'm actually quite pleased with it so far. What I found is I sort of already tied up some of them as I was thinking on the the further resolutions of certain parts of the game. Um, the different skills are a good example. For a while, as you know, I broke the skills down into how they function in different scenes, and then I kind of ebbed away from that a little bit. I was like, no, really, they should function more or less the same in every scene. And the only real distinction is if they're in a scene and they're skipping huge swathes of time, obviously the same pacing mechanisms about, or the same expectations about how long an action works are going to be different because we're going to be abstracting a large number of high results over a course of time. Um, and this was an extension of a rule that I've very commonly seen in this system, which is as soon as you are using this as a skill resolution system instead of an opposed combat mechanism, you can simply keep rolling until you get the result that you want. Now, obviously, human beings don't have the most powerful intuitive grasp of just how unlikely certain results are in these pools of D10. Um, it is vanishingly unlikely that we can get a set of higher than a certain number with a given pool of dice within the span not only of our lifetime but of the heat death of the universe. Like, there's an enormous, almost inconceivable number of results that can transpire whenever you're rolling a fistful of d10s, and this is good news in terms of unpredictability because it means we really are getting something close to a truly random result with them, which is wonderful. On the other hand, it's terrible news for people that want to keep rolling until all of their 10 dice line up with nines on them. Um, that it's just. And there's different ways you can resolve that, of course. There's my foremost appeal is table etiquette. Like, if you find yourself rolling over and over and nothing of consequences happening, probably we should just skip ahead. Um, and I mean, like, I really admire the D&D third edition way of doing it, which was you can take 10 and 20 on certain things depending on how much in-game time you're willing to put towards them, and that really did drive the design of the montage scene rules. Um, but I think I'm getting lost in the weeds here. I really enjoy talking about this game. I think about it all the time. I work on it all the time. And yesterday I thought I had the day off, but it turns out I didn't. So I kind of went into work frustrated, and I happened to work in a job where there's an unpredictable stretch of time once in a while where there's just no customers. And that'll happen sometimes. You're sitting at a station waiting for customers to come to you, and because of the stochastic reality of that, there will be sometimes stretches of time where there aren't a lot of customers. Um, and I happened to be blessed with a few. It was a Tuesday at my bank, and Tuesday isn't really the most um, demand heavy time for transactions. There's still a reasonable amount. Certainly enough to justify me being there all day. Possibly enough to justify how much they paid me for being there all day. I'm not certain. I somehow doubt it. They very generously compensate me for this job. Mm. well out of proportion to the amount of actual like daily effort it takes, which is nice. It also probably means I should be looking to foist more responsibility on myself, not only because it's more rewarding, but also because it'll be a little more engaging. But the point being is, this was not a particularly challenging day, and so I took this folder from my bank. I don't know if you can see this here. Ta-da! And I just wrote on it. And I wrote down a lot of my thinking about domains, which has been shaping up very, very concretely over these past couple of weeks. I wrote some game design bugaboos, which I'm really pleased with. One of which I think I'll share with you. It's not particularly relevant. I just happened to enjoy that I thought about this. I was, and I think this is game design bugaboo number 2. The first one, let me see. Yeah, I should remember the first one. I called them bugaboos because they didn't seem any more, they didn't seem particularly cogent as a thing that I could call an argument or a theory or anything as concrete and satisfying as that. So really it was just this kind of idea that popped into my head. Oh, my coffee's done. How delightful. I've only had one. Oh, this might have been the first one. Is it? Well, now I'm frustrated because I thought I had an additional bugaboo to share. The first one was actually a little bit irrelevant, but the second one felt really relevant because what I was doing was I was working through the domain section again, kind of just going over as much of it in my head as I could keep at one time. And what I found was I had this thing, and it's really easy to fall into this as a game designer as you add more and more to a system, where I could think of new terms and new processes for using those new terms. So basically I would call out certain significant things, give them a term associated with them, and then make a process that interacted with them. And it kind of took the form of, like, to do X, you must have Y resource and Z ability, and then you do, Q process. And what I found was, as you continue to do that, you start running out of numbers, or running out of letters to associate with them. You just keep adding more and more of the same thing, and suddenly you have this enormous system with a thousand different processes and different significant terms, and it's impossible to keep that in your head. And of course, it's possible to segment that. Oh yeah, actually, that was the thing that I had. That was the other bugaboo that I thought about. But it's possible to segment those into specific processes that only happen at certain times. Like D&D, the older editions of D&D especially do this a lot, where it's like, here's the process for exploring, here's the process for fighting, here's the process for hex crawling or traveling or adventuring or interacting with people, whatever. So there's a million different little cul-de-sac rules here and there, and it's more like learning the streets of an old neighborhood than it is about any kind of like high-minded intellectual and mathematical thing. It's much less user-friendly. It doesn't have the sort of GUI of a centralized mechanic that you can appeal to for everything. And that's kind of an Apple design anyway, having that sort of central thing. It's much more like, again, like an old school computer where you actually have to learn different file paths and type them in manually and figure out what all the different extension means and learn a bit of coding to actually make that computer do what you want it to do. And there's something redemptive in that. It's an exercise that demands more of your attention, and you really have to cradle those a little more carefully and work with them a little more intellectually. And I find that engagement to be satisfying. I also find it to be nearly impossible to achieve reliably because I live, like most of us, a very busy modern life, and I often come to games pretty stressed and burned out, and what I want is to switch off a little bit and get some emotional satisfaction, god damn it. And games, they've classically been able to provide me with that with a more eloquent system. And eloquence, by the way, is what I was reaching at here. So eloquence, I decided, and I wrote this down, I'm really happy about this, is achieved when the terms or processes are unified such that the smallest number of terms and processes remains. And I thought that was quite clever, because it means that you don't really have to sacrifice your broader goal of having your game as big as you want. What you need to do is find the places where you can combine ideas and create links between ideas that are meaningful and consistent. And so ultimately, you take this enormous number of terms and processes you've put together, and you push them all together and you compress the grand whole of them into this tiny diamond of a final game, and that is eloquence. It also doesn't leave a certain, it doesn't put an onus of a certain specific size on it. It doesn't say there must be one central mechanic, which I think is cutting too deep. I think that you leave out too many important things that the GM then has to essentially adjudicate if you break everything in a universe down into one central mechanic. I think that's far too much concentration. Now, I do think that having a sort of central gravity in a central resolution mechanic is a good idea, but I don't think that everything should ultimately be left to appeal to only that. For instance, the lack of like war game rules and the lack of meaningful like resource allocation rules and things like that in Apocalypse World is one of my senses of dissatisfaction with the game, because ultimately the skill check of do I succeed or not is not sufficient. Hi, kitty. Would you not play with that right here, right now? Here, go chase it over there. Venetian blinds and cats, man. Anyway, what is effectively a skill check from D&D 3rd Edition on 2d6 instead of a d20 is not sufficient for me to do all the things I want a universe to do. The universes just simply have scenarios that cannot be resolved by appealing to a skill check. It's just not, that doesn't work. And although I feel like I've gone a very long way for showing how much a skill check can really do and how versatile it really can be, especially when you have a more robust kind of skill check, something that's usable in more than one direction, like the old Marble Face Rip charts, which is what I used, you can go a long way when it comes to making a really sophisticated game with an extremely expansive power level. And I still had to go further. And going further was what the domain chapter was really about. We really do have almost every part of this game, except for those moments when we zoom out and we really take in the enormity of what these characters can accomplish on a large enough time scale. And that's a frightening part of the game design. I'm just going to leave the kitty crazies in this video. They're kind of adorable. I sort of wish the camera was on the cat and do like an RPG pundit thing where I'm just focusing on the cats. They're not my cats, though, so I don't know what the ethics are about filming them. And I like having my mug out here. I'm vain enough that I want y'all to see me. Oh. This is actually from the previous pot of coffee. It has gone cold now, unfortunately. But it's still delectably caffeinated. So that part was scary. The part where I really have to deal with the consequences of beings on the scale of capability that I've created. Doing the combat system really isn't that big of a deal. When you get right down to it, as long as you have something that is strategically interesting and gives you meaningful trade-offs, you are good. You really are. And I think we did that pretty well with just what we imported from the Legends of the Wulin system. It was already, if not perfect, extremely good. And it wasn't too much to build on that bedrock, like a few different assumptions. The first gulf between that game and the game that I wanted it to be was making a consequence, making a real world that you are a part of. Both that game and Weapons of the Gods both sort of hand-waved that part. It's like, you can do whatever you want to, that's cool. And they inherited that attitude from Jenna Morin, who inherited it from the Chronicles of Amber, where that was kind of the game. You were unbelievably superhuman at almost every mortal endeavor. And so when it came to, can you operate a car, it wasn't, well, make a skill check. It was, well, yes, of course you can. You're a genius. Given a few moments of interacting with any kind of unfamiliar technology, you could use this. There wasn't really a system for that. It wasn't necessary. If it was introduced in the same way a play would introduce it. It's Chekhov's gun. It will be fired. There you go. Oh god, I engaged both of them. It's going to get very loud in here. It was the same thing with any kind of physical thing. Can I lift this? Well, I mean, possibly. You're superhumanly strong. And so it really was a binary. Am I capable of lifting this on any time scale, yes or no? And the reason there wasn't much of a consequence for that in Chronicles of Amber is because reality didn't really exist the same way. The only real reality was Amber itself, and Amber itself was kind of like a little medieval Ren Fair sort of place. So there weren't a lot of guns or technology to worry about. It really was a sort of sword and sorcery sort of place. And most of the Amberites were kind of near you in their capability, so it was a game which interestingly reduced you whenever you got to that place, and that was the only place that really mattered. The Throne of Amber was what the game was all about. And so any of the other things you could accomplish, all the lasers and guns and rockets and bombs you could theoretically bring to Amber simply didn't work there. They weren't real enough to work. Actually, the Guns of Avalon, I think, the second book in the Amber series, is about the one kind of gun that worked in Amber, and it massively changed the power balance. But in terms of an RPG, that just wasn't something you really had to consider. So that hand waving attitude, that it doesn't really matter, the important thing is the fighting. It's not satisfying. It's not sustainable. Not if you want a game that's actually engaging. Because if you say the consequences don't matter, what you say is accomplishment does not matter. And if accomplishment doesn't matter, then what is everyone fighting about? Like in Weapons of the Gods, when you really boiled down the experience of that game, it was fighting to accomplish something. But once the fighting was concluded, once you stood victorious over your foe with Tiger Soul in your hand, what happened in the game? It was effectively over. There was nothing else to engage with in any meaningful way. I mean, you could literally end the game after a single fight scene and say, and then you conquered all of Shinzao. And that would be it, wouldn't it? That's not very satisfying. The conquest, the exploration, those things are things that I wanted in the game. And so I put them in. And that was a pretty big leap, honestly. Um, but that wasn't really far enough. Because when you see the horizon, you have to see if you can get to it. And we saw the horizon suddenly. We had the combat system, which worked just fine, and then to that framework, which we added a little bit to, but to that framework we added the sort of exploration and the more nuanced stuff from old school Dungeons and Dragons and similar games, where it mattered what you were doing. The skill system was developed, and the way you interacted with the world was developed, and how you made that world was developed, and those were all extremely critical things to do to bring this into the game that it needed to be. And the next grand gulf is saying, okay, when you pull back and you have all of those things, and all of those things are working very well together, and the moment to moment of action scenes and real time scenes, and even the skips all hang together beautifully in the GM chapter. They're all so gloriously done, and they work so wonderfully well in practice. What about on the long scale? What about whenever months pass at a time? When they go into seclusion to train, when they order their troops to go and conquer somewhere? What about whenever they need to make factories and churn out war machines? Like, what happens? And that's a pretty frightening place, because you have a lot of considerations, a lot of moving parts to it. And the value of those parts and how you have to think about them strategically all have to move together in a way that both makes sense in the real world and also makes sense in the sort of fictitious world we've built up, where there are these mighty martial artists and terrible monsters and bizarre phenomenon that are going on at the same time. And the ecosystem that arises from the interaction of those elements is unpredictable. I don't actually know what's going to happen whenever I start putting these things down together and having them interact. Because the system that I'm crafting for them to interact, I feel like it's that the domain system, that's what I'm working on now. It feels right. It feels like whenever you make decisions, they hold together for both of those extreme poles of reality and the strange superpowered world we've created. There's not anything in there this time, Inky. But, and this is a very important but, when you playtest these things, they interact in ways you don't expect. And what arises from them is the game. The ideas, the theories, the rules you've made, that's just the foundation. The house on that foundation is the gameplay, the emergent experience of playing the game. And this is where a lot of designers fall short. A lot of designers end theory, and they say the game is the responsibility of the GM. Famously, White Wolf has done this. But Luke Crane did this, and like a lot of designers did this. Luke Crane, of course, has the redeeming aspect that he plays his own games pretty thoroughly, and so he at least can claim to play tested them. Um, Even if my particular experience with, say, Burning Wheel diverged a lot from what was advertised, I can still say it was an experience that had a consistency to it that could have only emerged from playtesting. Um, Now, I think that Luke could have used the discipline of the knife. He could have cut a few things and said, it's complete because it ends here. It's Dune, by the way. I'm going to see Dune this week. I'm very excited. Um, but, but yeah, okay. Even there is something charming about not doing that. And there is something kind of old school about the idea that you can just sort of bloviate in whatever section and indulge in your weirdest ideas and just leave that in your book, and that's fine. I wouldn't say it's succinct, and I wouldn't necessarily call it usable, but it's usable in so much as that it is referenceable outside of play prior to the play beginning, and then in play it's not strictly necessary to reference it in detail. That being said, Burning Wheel is such a gorgeous disaster. It's such a sprawling mess of a game, and it does have quite a bit of charm to it. I wonder how much of that I'm inadvertently doing in my game. I think my indulgences in these systems is insane, but what would the consequence of that be? What would the consequence of that be? I'm really only interested in that few months time frame. 2, 3 months at a time. A montage scene, a campaign arc. I'm really happy with the way all this is holding together, and I think I'm going to share it with you today. It's not quite complete, but I'm going to share it with my backers today. This is a big video, and it's covered a lot of ground. And the reason it's big is because this chapter is big. It's maybe the biggest thing I've ever written, and almost entirely designed just by me. I'm not really basing this off of another system, which is nice. The closest analog to it would be that I've experienced at least is the Adventure Conquer King Domain Management System, and I did actually steal that name. I think Domain is perfect, um, but it's very distinct from that system, and it does very distinct things. And this is the first chapter that feels almost completely mine. So I'm both proud and terrified of that. Uh, I knew that the face rip skill system would work. Like I didn't, because that's what it was for, right? It was for superheroes, and this is what we're making here. It's a kung fu superhero game. I knew the Legends of the Wulin fighting system worked. I knew it from play. I knew it. What it really needed was just a little bit of streamlining and a few, you cuts for eloquence, a few combinings of things, and we really got something fantastic out of that. Um, I knew that the Exalted system didn't work, and I took a lot of lessons from how it didn't work. The second edition system is what I'm referring to. I'm not actually that familiar with the third edition. Um, and and yeah, I knew the old school hex crawling and dungeon crawling stuff worked. I knew the pacing mechanisms worked. I pretty much knew all these other systems worked because I didn't invent them. These are all things that I took from other much very very brilliant people, and I put them together. And the putting them together in the way that they were put together, that was mine, but the actual initial design was not. And so I'm kind of coming full circle from the beginning of this video, where I was like, "Oh, I've done so much. I'm the sole designer." Well, not really. I am the prophet of much greater designers before me. But here is a chapter in which I am the sole designer. I really did pioneer this stuff. And so I'm proud of it, and I'm also terrified of it because to to create something like that, it's untested, and it's untested in a way that might be impossible for me to test before I need to actually kick it out the door and publish it and give it to all of you wonderful mutants. It's it's concerning. It's concerning because it's so vast and it's so new. It feels right though. And I suppose maybe I'm just going to have to go with my gut on this one. That's kind of unsatisfying, but I'll tell you what. I'll let you all be the judge. Without further ado, here is my work on the domains chapter. I think you're really going to enjoy it. Um, yep. Well, folks, that's nearly half an hour of your days I've bloviated, so I'm going to call it here. Thank you for your indulgence once again, and I hope that you enjoy this domains chapter. I hope you find it very useful and very fun and very cool. I hope it sparks for you. It certainly feels like it's sparking for me, so I'm very satisfied with it. So enjoy.